Great. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Thursday webinar. I hope everybody's had a great week so far. I am a little wound up right now. I'll tell you more about my morning's adventures here as we dig into the webinar. So I'm trying to not like talk a million miles an hour. So if I sound a little stilted, it's because I'm forcefully slowing myself down right now because I am a little kind of riled up. So today we are going to talk about the offline capabilities in Power Apps. These have been around for a little while. I haven't seen a ton of documentation on them, and there's definitely some places where I am hopeful we will see some expansion and some things made a little easier, but I wanted to go through what's available right now for you if you're interested in building an app that can be used offline. So, what we're going to look at is, first off, how do you determine the user's online status? I also found a little tip that you can maybe leverage to determine whether they're using the web version of Power Apps or whether they are on a mobile device. We'll look at how to cache supplemental data for use when offline, how to store new items and updates for submittal when the user's back online, which obviously we want to do for them, and leveraging a timer control to check for online status. And I also want to talk about options for handling conflict resolution. I have not added anything around conflict resolution in the sample apps that I have for you after this webinar, partially because a lot of what you do there is going to be determined by how your organization deals with data loss or overwrites. If you're dealing with people who are perfectly comfortable with the idea that the last person who saves wins, that's one thing. If you're not, that's another thing. So, and also I didn't have a billion hours to spend on a sample app. So that kind of also impacted what all I could do with this sample. When you're planning your offline capable app, I feel like there's a lot of things to think about. And I think it's better to kind of know up front what you're getting into. The documentation that I found and the tutorial that I somewhat followed to set mine up, I'll direct you to that. But as is often the case with online tutorials and documentation, it feels as if they took kind of the simplest possible example. And I don't feel that that simplest possible example always translates very well to real world requirements. And I know most of you are working with real world users and building real world stuff. And so I think it's important to kind of think in advance about the types of challenges you may be facing when you develop an offline capable app, so you can talk to your stakeholders or your users and come to some balance between developmental time, maintenance requirements, how complicated is this thing going to be. So one of the first things that I realized was that the two commands that are used in these offline capable apps, save data and load data, those aren't compatible with the web version of Power Apps. This is going to change your development process. So if you are used to working in Power Apps and then hitting preview and checking it out in the browser, you're going to quickly find that you're not going to be able to test these apps that way because you're going to get an error back on save data and load data. So that can increase your development time. One of the things I've really loved about Power Apps is, first off, being able to test things in app. So when you're in the design mode, you can do an alt click on a control and test it. You don't always have to preview and go through whatever loading logic or anything else, data loads that you have there. So I've really appreciated that. And I found that a little frustrating as I was working. Now let me find my web browser here. I found this discussion, and I've got a link to this in the slides, and you may want to take a look at it, that talks about, how are you going to work around these commands, these functions not being available? And what they suggested was checking for the presence of acceleration, with the idea that mobile devices have accelerometers. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And so if there was the presence of acceleration, you can determine whether or not the person's using the desktop. I'm in the web version of this. I'm on my desktop machine or my laptop versus on a mobile device. So that was just one suggestion I saw. Didn't check it out, but it's worth taking a look at. So I included a link to that in these slides. Data loads. You need to think about data loads in your app. Okay, the documentation states that save data and load data work best with small amounts of data. So if you have some mega database table that is required for this app and you want to use it offline, you're going to have to be prepared for performance hits. It would be better to, if you're loading data, find a way to pre-filter it, or maybe your offline capability is limited. Maybe you say, oh, if you're online, we'll let you search for any of these items, and if you're offline, you can only look at the items that belong to you. So again, something to talk to your stakeholders about or to think about during your design process. I wouldn't allow users to add or view attachments or video or other storage intensive stuff. Look, you can tell if the user's connected. There's a function for that. And then you can show and hide stuff based on that. You can set your data query to only pull back the stuff you need that doesn't include that. So you're going to want to think about what kinds of logic you need in these special circumstances. And it may be that you end up with two versions of your app, right? That may be the simplest approach for your scenario, where you have one version that you're like, here you go, guys, use this one when you're offline. And here's the full featured app that we use when we're online or at our desks. So that's another option to consider. And I just want you to think about things. Don't be like me, plan first, right? You need to think about conflict resolution. So the sample app is not handling for these scenarios. It's just stuff you're going to want to think about. You've got to decide what you're going to do, if anything, for edits, adds, or deletes that conflict with another user's. And this is huge. We're going to talk about it after the demo because I've got a lot of thoughts on this. You guys have listened to me before. You know I'm like a data integrity fiend. I care deeply about making sure that data does what we think it's going to do and that we're saving what we've promised the user we're going to save. And so data integrity is as developers, right, it's one of our higher callings. It's one of these things that we commit to. We're going to protect your data. We're going to protect you from damaging your data. So you really want to think about conflict resolution, what you're going to promise, how your app's going to behave, and your consistency therein. So we'll look at that at the end and talk a little more about it, because I don't want you guys to fall asleep before the demo. Unsaved data. How are you going to deal with that? So when we look at the sample app, you're going to see that we're caching your unsaved edits, your unsaved ads. We're saving those locally on your device. And then when you connect, we're going to submit all that. So how are you going to handle, or are you going to allow the user to create a new item and then edit that new item all before anything gets submitted? You want to think about that. How are you going to handle for that in your local storage? Where are you going to update that? How complicated are your functions going to get if you're going to allow that? Are you going to let them add something and then delete it before it gets submitted? You'll need to be clearing that out of your local collections then at that point. What about deletes in general? Your general delete option runs a remove function, and you're not connected to your main data source because you're offline. So you can't really remove it. You're going to have to store the ID, and then once they're online again, go handle for any of your removals. So you'd have to create probably a collection for those IDs. Now in my sample app, I just pulled the delete button off. in your offline apps, you may choose to hide the delete button in the details screen if the user isn't online. So again, just think through some of the complexity that's involved here before you decide what functions should be available offline. And also, if I close the app when I'm offline and then I reopen it once I'm online, what should happen? And the reason I mention that is because these are some of the scenarios that really aren't covered in the blog post that I followed that reviews this capability. So my neighbor's dog, I hope, is not disturbing you. He's barking at a squirrel. It's fall and the squirrels are busy, and that just gets the dogs riled up. So here's our basic approach. This is basically what we're going to do. We're going to first off check if the user is online. I see I have a nice typo there. I'll get that fixed up before I send you the slides. Determine if user is online. We're looking at connection.connected. It returns true and false. So if the user is connected, we're going to create a collection that has the app data, and we're going to copy that app data into local storage. That way later on when they connect and they're not, when they open the app and they're not connected, we've got this data cached in local storage, okay? If they're not connected, we're just going to go get that app data from local storage and load it into the collection, okay? And we're going to leverage that collection instead of leveraging our data source directly. The user can browse, see details, and edit as normal. So it all just works the same on the user's point of view. On submit of the edit form, I'm using an edit form in this demo, we're going to check to see if the user is connected. If they're connected, we're going to submit the form, refresh the collection so it has the latest, and we're going to update the local save data with the latest, okay? All of this is just because, well, now we're connected, we've submitted, there's new items, so now we need to go update the collection that I'm using and my local save data with the new items. Now, if they're not connected, we're going to add the new or edited data to its own collection for later upload, and we're going to save this locally as well. So basically, if you're not connected, we're just stashing that data, and then once you're connected again, we're going to submit it. And maybe this stuff doesn't make a lot of sense until we look at the demo. So that's what we're going to do now. So let me just see if I can find my taskbar again. This is also complicated for me. You'd think I'd never done it before. I've got a link to this in the slides. This is the basic blog post that I followed. One thing I did differently was I started with an auto-generated app from my list, and then I modified it to follow along with the blog. So the approach you take there is going to depend on kind of the complexity of what you're doing and maybe some of your laziness factor. I'm pretty lazy, so I usually start with an auto-generated app for this kind of stuff instead of starting from scratch. Okay, so I had not yet opened my list, and I'm going to get that open just because I'd like to have it open somewhere. I keep moving around my my GoToMeeting console, so I'm just going to hit edit data here so this pops open. Okay, so I've got two versions of this app, and I've packed both of them up for you guys to take the survey afterwards. I'll send you the list template and both versions of this app. The reason I have two versions is because I got to thinking about how I was going to show you guys the app running. And obviously, if I'm demoing from my phone, and then I put my phone in airplane mode so I'm offline, I'm going to have some challenges screen sharing. So that was kind of my concern there. So this one has some slight differences from the one with demo in the name. This one is closer to what they have in the blog post. And in the blog post, they started with kind of a button to give you your first steps in this offline capability. You can also put this in on start, which is what I did in the demo version. Okay, so here we're checking to see if you're connected, right? If you're connected, I'm clearing a collection. Mine's called work list. And then I'm adding all of these items. Those are the items from my SharePoint list. The next thing I'm doing if I'm connected is I'm saving this data, and it's work list, and I'm saving it to local storage, and I'm calling what I'm saving, I'm calling that saved data cache, working in local storage. One thing to keep in mind when you're building your offline app don't be like me and make sure you make a note of what you are calling your local storage cache, okay? Because autocomplete's not going to help you with this one thing. And so you're going to be like, why doesn't my app work? Well, it's because you called this slightly different things in different places. So keep track of that, okay? Now, here's the false portion of my statement, right? The comma is separating the true portion from the false portion. And so here is my else value. So if I am not connected, right, this save collection of work list, I'm going to load it up with what's saved here. This variable right here, ignore non-existent file, that sure comes in useful. It's not mentioned in the implementing offline capability, but that is part of the load data function, is you've got this option of ignoring a non-existent file. So if the user is opening this app for the first time and there isn't a file called working in local storage and they're offline, they aren't going to get an error. Okay, so we want to make sure that we aren't throwing an error if this file doesn't exist, and that's what the true is for. And then we're also loading data to a second collection called work to be added, and this one I've named new work in local storage. Now, this second collection is the stuff that has not been submitted yet, that's hanging around on my device. Okay, so we'll take a look at that edit form and we'll take a look at that. So next we move over to the browse screen, and that's where we are going from this function. Let me just roll this bad boy back up. So we go over to the browse screen. Now here in the browse screen, oh, I see I hopefully kept my debugging label there. Here in the browse screen, because we haven't actually loaded any data here, we kind of have nothing showing, but that's all right. The browse screen is now using for its gallery that work list, okay? So when I created this app and did an auto-generated app, what happened was it was connected to my actual SharePoint list. But instead, I modified this to use this collection instead, because that's where I'm storing the data. So I don't want to like, I don't want to be terribly boring, but just to kind of help make sure we're not confused, I'm collecting my stuff in work list, okay, and I'm also saving it locally. And then over here in the browse gallery for my items, I'm using work list. So basically what I did was I took my auto-generated app, and instead of directly using my data source, I've got it in a collection now. The reason I've got it in a collection is so I can save it and reload it from local storage if my user is offline. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. The only change I made on the detail screen was I got rid of the delete button. So you'll notice that the data source here is still working in a coal mine, and the item property should be browse gallery 1 selected. Okay, and then moving forward to my edit screen, here's my edit screen, my edit form. Okay, again, my data source is working in a coal mine. My item is my browse gallery 1 selected. Okay, so these things, they stayed unchanged, right? But I did change this guy right here. And let's go ahead and make him bigger so you can see what's going on there. So if we take a look at this guy, you're not going to go any bigger for me. That's all right. All right, so once again, we're looking at, okay, what has happened? Okay, I think I had an audio hiccup. I had a little something pop up and tell me my audio had been lost, but it seems to be back now. So who knows what's going on? It's been one of those mornings. So we are on the edit form. We're looking at the button that you click to state that you want to save this, the icon accept. And this is one of the things I did end up changing. So again, if connection is connected, we're checking to see if the user's connected, okay? If they are connected, we're submitting the form. We are refreshing our data source. And then we are going to go ahead and we're going to clear that collection that we're using for all of our stuff, right? And that way we've got the latest and greatest. We're going to go ahead and save that data locally once again, because after all, we don't know. User could go offline at any time. Our users are very hard to pin down. And then we're going to go ahead and we navigate back to our main browse screen, because I just thought, well, we'll just take you back to your regular browse screen once you've completed your submit. Okay, so now what we do if you are not connected. So my user is not connected, so I have to do something different. So I'm going to collect this item into work to be added. So this is the stuff that I'm going to add. These are all the values. And then I'm going to go ahead and save that data in my local storage. Okay, and so this way I've got it saved, it's local, and it's ready to be submitted. And then let's see if this will let me get down there. I navigate them to my unsaved work screen. Okay, so this was a new screen that I added, and this was pretty much following the blog post. Okay, and this gallery has my work to be added. So I did something. I created a new item. It goes into my work to be added collection. It gets saved locally too, so it's there. And then I navigate them to this new screen that has a gallery displaying all the stuff that's to be added, right? And it has a little timer control. And this timer control has an on timer end, has a function on timer end. And you can set the timer for whatever you like. In my other demo that I'm actually going to show you in action, the timer is set to 15 seconds because we would all get bored waiting for 30 seconds to pass for it to submit. Okay, so we're basically saying, look, if it's connected and the work to be added is more than 0 rows, then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to collect it. And then I clear that collection. And then I save that data back to new work and local storage. Why am I doing this? to clear out that new work and local storage, right? So if I've got a clear collection and then I'm saving it back to my cached data, then that's going to give me no data in that cache, right? And that way you don't end up accidentally resubmitting the same stuff again and again. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to refresh this data source. Sorry, my brain just stopped again. And then I'm going to collect it again so I've got it. And then I'm going to save it locally again. Okay, and so I'm only doing stuff if my thing is true here. So if my condition is true, I'm going to do all of this stuff. If it's false, I'm not going to do anything. Timer's just going to start over again and wait for my user to get online. Okay, we're going to go look at this in process. Oh, look, I've got a test submitted. I thought I had cleaned all that up. Every time I think I've cleaned my list up, I have not. So there's my list all cleaned up again. In my test demo, which I'm also going to send to you, first off, I'm using on start to check these things. And I'm also by default setting is connected to equal true. Data cannot be saved when running in a web browser. Gee, thanks. So you can see I've got an error already here just because this is on start, but that's all right. We'll ignore that. It's not an actual error with the application. It's just the on start function runs when you open your app in design mode, and save data doesn't work in the web browser. So bingo, I get an error. So in this case, what I've done is I've created a variable called isConnected, and then I've got a couple buttons to set whether I'm connected or not. And the reason I did that was because, like I said, I want to be able to demo this to you from my phone without having to disconnect, which means I can't share. Now, all of that said, this is why I was a little hysterical when we first started. And that's because I could not screen share from my phone in GoToWebinar. Now I could in GoToMeeting. So I have a GoToMeeting popped up here. And let me just make sure I'm broadcasting from my phone. I'm going to stop and then start again. And that way, hopefully, it'll pop up. My phone went to sleep, of course. There we go. All right. So yeah, let me know all about that. And let's get back. Whoops, not where I wanted to go. Sorry, you guys. Watch me try to navigate. Yeah, I had thought that I had tried GoToMeeting screen sharing from my phone and it had worked great. And so I started this webinar this morning and I was like, fantastic, this is going to be perfect. And then I found out that no, it was not going to be perfect because GoToWebinar didn't seem to have the same ability to screen share from my phone. I was trying to read the documentation all in a flurry and it was like, well, it looks like maybe I could screen share if I was on my iPad. So instead I ended up remoting onto a server, which is why I've got Remote Desktop Connection Manager opened, because I can't be joined to a GoToMeeting and a GoToWebinar at the same time on my desktop. And that is why we are watching the demo this way, and why I'm kind of hyper and wound up, because I was trying to troubleshoot all this within the course of like 2 minutes. And I'm like, oh, this doesn't do well for me. I'm like Little Miss Prepare in advance. Okay, so you can see I'm out of the mine because that's disabled. I'm going to click the Let's Work button to get to my gallery. So here's my gallery. I'm going to add a new thing, and I'm going to call this new thing, and my description is going to be new thing. And I'm going to give it a date, and I'm going to say okay. I'm going to hit my check mark. Okay, so here's my new thing, and you can see I'm back in my regular browse gallery. I'm going to go back to my main screen, and now I'm going to go into the mine. So now I am offline because I'm using a variable for that. I've gone ahead and I've set a variable. Okay, and now I'm going to add an offline thing. And I'm going to call this offline thing. And we'll give it a date just because I like the calendar control. And I'm going to click the checkbox. Okay, so this puts me into my unsaved work and starts counting down the timer. Now I'm going to go ahead and, I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm out of the mine and hit check unsaved data. So now my timer is still counting down. I believe I set this one to 15. There it goes. And you saw the dots run across the top of the screen, and my item disappeared. It's like magic. And so if we go back over here, you can see offline thing is already there. Okay, so it works well. Okay. Obviously, the demo with the buttons isn't quite the same thing as literally putting your phone in airplane mode. I did test the initial app that doesn't use a variable in airplane mode, but there's just no good way to show that to you. But I do encourage you to fill out the survey, get the webinar package, and then import these Power Apps in the list so that you can, try them in your environment and kind of see how this works if offline capabilities are something you need. I'm going to go ahead and pop back to the slides, and let's talk briefly about conflict resolution before I let you go, okay? So when you're thinking about conflict resolution, you have to think about who's going to win. Right? If Joe deletes an item and he's offline, and Sue edits the same item when she's offline, who decides what happens? If Joe comes online and the item is deleted, and then Sue comes online and submits an update, what should happen? Right? You're going to have a problem updating an item that doesn't exist, but whose change is more valid? How do you decide that? Can you automatically resolve these issues? Do you have to let the users resolve them? Are you tracking enough information to determine if there's a more recent change? SharePoint has modified and created, and I'm pretty sure Common Data Service has that as well. But if you're kind of rolling your own solution, you're going to want to make sure you're including at least date and user info if you're going to handle for conflict resolution at all. Now, I'm going to, and this is not, I'm not being snarky. They mention, here that the functions do not automatically resolve merge conflicts when a device returns to connectivity from offline. They're working to expand the capabilities to increase this and that, and future automatically handle decisions about what to save and how to handle conflicts. So they do mention that in here. And I just want to see, I thought there was another, there we go. They mentioned that, you have to come up with a policy to resolve them. It's going to be easier to grasp once you understand the capabilities described. They suggest maybe they'll write another article. I didn't see that. This is the piece that I found a little, I don't know. They said most of the customer scenarios we heard don't even need conflict resolution. I feel like that's kind of a cop-out. I think most scenarios do need conflict resolution. So keep that in mind when you think about offline. Do you need conflict resolution? What level do you need? So merging, are you going to be able to automatically merge changes that don't conflict? Maybe that's something you can do. Maybe you can check your original item, check it against the different things that have been submitted, see what can be merged automatically. Are you going to display the differences to let the user choose what to do? Oh, hey, Sue, while you were offline, Joe made this change. What do you think? Keep it or get rid of it? That's kind of what TFS does, right? So if you're working with Visual Studio, you might be familiar with some of that. Definitely want to be consistent. So if you pick a policy, you want to stick with that policy. Don't do one thing sometimes and another thing some other times, unless that's your policy. But you definitely want to be consistent. And versioning. Maybe versioning helps answer some of these questions. Maybe if you have versioning turned on, that gives you some better options. Now, I did find an article that I found was interesting. And I included a link to it. It's heavy reading. I found it. A lot of it was beyond me. However, some of the diagrams and some of the basic samples that were used in this specific article about, how do you think about who wins? I think it's a good thing to take a look at, operational transformations as an algorithm for automatic conflict resolution. So that's a mouthful, but at least some of the diagrams and illustrations might be helpful as you're thinking about conflict resolution. And again, I'm not encouraging you to build the most complicated application in the world. If you are tracking something simple and easy, I wouldn't even think about it. Like I submit a leave request, well, nobody else would be overwriting or updating or editing my leave request, right? It would just be somebody approving it. So there's a lot of scenarios where it's just not necessary, but there are a lot of scenarios where it is necessary. And I encourage you to, do your homework and think through it before you build, right? That's really what I'm getting down to, is make sure you've thought about these things, right? I don't want you backing yourself into a corner. All right, so before I wrap this up, does anybody have any questions? If you do, feel free to type those up now. If you don't, that's great too. I encourage you to fill out the post-webinar survey. I've got stuff packed up to send to you. I'll fix the typo in my slide and get you guys these packages so you've got these Power Apps to play with, and it'll give you a sense of at least some of the ways we can deal with offline capabilities in Power Apps. All right, I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Quick pay in the bills slide, and that is about FormsViewer. Definitely, if you have not used FormsViewer and you need to extend your InfoPath Forms investment, I would encourage you to look into it. We're adding stuff to it all the time. And it's definitely a great way to keep using the InfoPath forms you've spent time on. There's no reason to rebuild everything from scratch. So I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.